A blessed Transfiguration Sunday to us all. Of the lesser Christian holy days, I love this one the most. It is just so mystical and ethereal and different to our everyday lives. Several years ago on Transfiguration Sunday in my home church, my friend John and I were serving as the primary liturgists alongside our then pastor, Peter. So there we were, Peter, James, and John in the chancel, just like Peter, James, and John with Jesus in this morning's reading. Whenever I see James and John listed together, I think of my good friend. Today we mark the end of the season of Epiphany, and we'll on Ash Wednesday begin our Lenten journey. Epiphany is a season of light, of growing knowledge of whom Jesus is. Lent is alternatively a solemn season leading to the cross. As we reach the end of one season and begin another, St. Matthew's account of the Transfiguration is particularly appropriate. The Transfiguration occurs almost immediately after Jesus has explained to his 12 closest disciples that he will undergo great suffering and die. What follows is basically a slow journey to Jerusalem and ultimately Calvary. Here we have for the disciples a dazzling revelation of who Jesus is with the declaration, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." Up on the mountain, the disciples receive a marvelous epiphany, but they still have much to learn from Jesus on the way to Jerusalem. In St. Matthew's Gospel, before the Transfiguration, Jesus asks the disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah, or one of the other prophets." Jesus said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Apparently, Peter gets it. He has affirmed that Jesus is indeed the Messiah. It would appear that the disciples, who up to this point are painted as bumbling buffoons, are finally starting to get it. But immediately after this, we're told that Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. After Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "God forbid it, Lord, this must never happen to you." But Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Peter has just declared that Jesus is in fact the Messiah. Yet he has the audacity to challenge Jesus and to tell Jesus that this is not the way it is supposed to happen. As I've said many times, Peter and the disciples have left their families, their homes, their friends, and their careers to follow Jesus. But yet, they don't fully understand what it means to follow Jesus. Their ideas of a Messiah who breaks into the world powerfully and victoriously with a radical revolutionary overthrow of Rome still reign in their hearts and minds. They were not prepared for the way that Jesus would show them for power shown through servanthood and suffering. When during the Transfiguration God's voice bellows from the cloud, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him," it sounds as a rebuke to the disciples. The subtext might be that you have chosen the way which is right and good, but you must unharden your hearts and truly listen in order to go the true path of discipleship. After Jesus had rebuked Peter, he told the crowd around them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it." No doubt the disciples began questioning what they'd gotten themselves into, wondering what this suffering could be, when and if it was really worth it. Dr. James Boyce of Luther Seminary writes, "In the same way, the question for hearers today is whether we who have heard Jesus call and followed him through these series of epiphanies will be just as eager to follow him where he leads us on his way to the cross." Jesus certainly knew that the disciples might be questioning their commitment. Wise it was then to take his inner circle of disciples up to the mountain, away from the crowds, perhaps to pray, reflect, and get some sense into Peter's head. It is vital to note here that James, John, and Peter, the three who witnessed the Transfiguration, also became the three most important leaders in the early Christian church in Rome, Jerusalem, and Antioch. So the disciples go up to the mountain with Jesus, likely expecting some private teaching from him, but with not even so much as a voice saying, "And now for something completely different." Jesus' clothes become astoundingly bright and effervescently white at the top of the mountain. The gospel makes it clear that this was no trick or sleight of hand, saying while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed and his clothes became dazzling white. The disciples suddenly see Moses, the giver of the law, and Elijah, the greatest prophet, surrounding Jesus, speaking with him. Can you imagine it? Jesus shining brightly with the company of the greatest men of God ever known. It is almost incomprehensible. Surely the disciples were astounded and at a loss for what to do, amazed by this revelation. Peter, ever impulsive, suggests building 3 booths for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. He is basically suggesting a resurgence of the festival of booths, during which booths or tents were built to commemorate the Israelites' exodus from Egypt. So Peter sees this as a watershed moment, almost as important as the Exodus. We hear no response from Jesus on this, but after the cloud descends and God declares, "This is my Son, the beloved, listen to him," Moses and Elijah disappear. So much comes together in this brief moment. No wonder the gospel says the disciples were terrified and fell on the ground. Moses went up to Mount Sinai to receive God's law and came down from the mountain with his face shining like the sun, as radiantly as Jesus' clothes. And then there is a passage from 2 Kings in which Elijah is carried off to heaven. Lance Stone, a minister of the United Reformed Church of the UK, suggests a much starker comparison. Here in this story of transfiguration, Jesus' clothes shine with the glory of God. There at the crucifixion, the soldiers gamble for Jesus' clothes. Here in this story, Jesus is surrounded by 2 great heroes from ancient history. There on the cross, he is surrounded by 2 common criminals. Here at the Transfiguration, Jesus is witnessed by 3 male disciples. There at Golgotha, 3 women are named as witnesses. Again, this scene of Transfiguration is at once a scene of dazzling light, while the crucifixion, Matthew tells us that darkness came over the whole land. Here in this scene, Jesus basks in God's presence. There he suffers the hell of God's absence. And he cries out, my God, God, why have you forsaken me? Here on the mountain, God confesses Jesus as God's Son as the voice sounds forth. There, in utter abandonment, it is left to a Roman centurion to blurt out, truly this man was God's Son. The disciples could not fully comprehend what happened on the mountain for those brief moments until they lived through Christ's death and resurrection. This account, as well as the crucifixion, resembles too the resurrection, with Jesus' clothes dazzling white and two heavenly beings by his side. So soon after Peter has declared Jesus to be the Messiah, he, along with James and John, see a reflection of what this truly means. The transfiguration did not change Jesus. In this moment, Jesus of Nazareth did not become Jesus Christ. He was not suddenly infused with holy power. Indeed, he already had it, as evidenced by the miracles and healings that he performed prior to this event. What happens, rather, is more of a transformation of Peter, James, and John. They still do not know the suffering, the persecution that awaits them, but they are privileged to witness a momentary lifting of the veil between heaven and earth, a glimpse of the kingdom of God to be, and Christ in his glory. In this brief moment, which they do not yet fully understand, that must sustain them on the road to Jerusalem. Whatever awaits them, whatever trials they are yet to endure, they have been confirmed in their belief as Jesus as the anointed one of God. In one of his last speeches, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. famously said, "We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop, and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." He said those words on the night before he was killed. Dr. King's own mountaintop experiences sustained him in the midst of the turmoil and the great burden put upon him as the focal point of the entire civil rights movement. It is such experiences when we meet God face to face that can sustain us when we have to make our long journeys through the desert. Through the mountaintop experience, the disciples begin to see more fully who Jesus is and are prompted by God to listen to his beloved. Throughout the gospel, St. Matthew, through miracles and healings, attempts to create an understanding of who Jesus is. The Transfiguration is one such story that illustrates and leads us to greater understanding of Jesus. And this is not to say that it's merely a story or a literary device used by the gospel authors. Its appearance in the first three gospels and Peter's second letter points to the fact that this was an important moment for these disciples, especially for Peter to record it himself. And it was an important moment for them both in their own journeys and one that can illuminate our journeys as well. As I said, the event is so mystical, so contrary to the world we typically experience. But to discount it is to discount the ways God can radically enter the world and interact with God's creation. So what does it mean for us to be transformed or transfigured, to be fully realized into our God-given vocations, who God has called us to be? Is an alcoholic who turns away from the bottle and becomes sober, transfigured? Is the racist who recognizes the error of her ways and seeks reconciliation, is she transfigured? Are we transfigured when seen anew through the eyes of someone deeply in love with us? I believe that we are. And I believe that when we strive to live into the fullness of who God calls us to be, we are transfigured as well. Like Moses, we will come down from the mountaintop with our faces shining like the sun. Who stands with you on that mountain, declaring what is fulfilled in you? Which saints of glory stand by your side then? This is not to compare us with Jesus, but to affirm that like Peter, James, and John, when we truly see who Jesus is, can we see who we are called to be as well. The more we know about Jesus, the more we understand about the way of life that he calls us to. In closing, I'd like to share with you a reading from the Church of Scotland, which eloquently addresses some of these questions. My name is Abraham, but that has not always been my name. Before the journey, before the star map, before wandering in the desert, before the child born to a 100-year-old pensioner, before sand grains became promises, before the attempted sacrifice of Isaac, I was Abram. But then the call and a new name. My name is Israel, but that has not always been my name. Before making peace with Esau, before 12 sons, before the dreams of Joseph and the colored coat, before the kidnapping, before the droughts, I was Jacob. But then the call and a new name. My name is Peter, but that has not always been my name. Before the discarding of nets, before the walking on water, before the confession, before the denial, before running to the tomb, before being called the Rock, I was Simon. But then the call and a new name. My name is Paul, but that has not always been my name. Before Damascus, before the letters, before the thorn in my side, before preaching to the Gentiles, before Antioch, before imprisonment, I was Saul. But then the call and a new name. The call to a wilderness journey where stars have names and sand grains whisper between your toes. I was settled, retired, and comfortable. Now I'm a new father. I have a young family and an old wife and a career in futures. Life is always being transformed and every so often given a new meaning, transfigured by God's own hand. I am Abram. Now I am Abraham. By God's grace, who will you become? The call to a wilderness journey to a new land and a wrestling match with God. I was restless, I was pushy and dishonest, the trickster. Now I'm settled, live in honesty with my 11 sons, rejoice at finding the 12th one in Egypt, and long for the prospect of a peaceful retirement. Life is always being transformed and every so often given new meaning, transfigured by God's own hand. I was Jacob, now I am Israel. By God's grace, who will you become? A call to a wilderness journey of discipleship and cross-carrying, of foot-washing and broken bread. I was hot-headed, misunderstanding everything, jumping out of boats and sinking, embarrassed to confess on the night of his death Jesus as Lord. Now I am the Rock, recognizing the truth of the empty tomb, happy to confess Jesus as my Savior right to the point of death. Life is always being transformed and every so often given new meaning, transfigured by God's own hand. I was Simon, now I am Peter. By God's grace, who will you become? The call to a wilderness journey to where there is no difference between slave and free, Jew and Gentile. I was racist, holding the coats, persecuting a new faith that questioned my own. Now I am in prison for their sake, for I am committed to the cause of Christ, an apostle to those I once persecuted. Life is always being transformed, and every so often given new meaning, transfigured by God's own hand. I was Saul, now I am Paul. By God's grace, who will you become?